During El Salvador's civil war in 1980, these children were captured by the army and accused of being traitors. They had a happy childhood, but the war came to their village, and everything changed. They had to avoid being recruited. Voces Inocentes is a film based on true events. In 1980, a civil war raged in El Salvador that lasted 12 years. It all began as an agrarian conflict and ended with a confrontation between the army and peasants. We begin by meeting Chava. His father left them to go to the United States. The boy's life was simple because even though the army was guarding the village, he could still attend school and play with his friends. However, the children couldn't be late home. Chava's mother scolded him, and the soldiers could kill him. The next day, several soldiers began harassing a man with an intellectual disability. He was a friend of the children. The children noticed what they were doing to him and called him to help. At that moment, everyone saw how they were recruiting several children. All children were forced to join the army when they turned 12. Everyone was afraid. Chava had a few months left until his 12th birthday. Chava was already home, and his mother was going to work. She asked him to look after his brothers. Hours later, it began to rain, and unfortunately, a confrontation broke out between soldiers and rebels. Chava protected his brothers and placed the mattress against the wall, and they hid under the bed. Ricardo cried, and Chava tried to entertain him and put on face paint. Later, his mother returned from work and, seeing the bodies lying around, thought the worst. The next day, the woman told her mother what had happened. She planned to quit her job. Her mother advised her not to because they needed money. She suggested moving in with her so she could take care of the children while she worked. The woman said that if she moved, her husband wouldn't be able to find her when he returned. The mother understood and gave her her savings. She should at least buy a gun. However, the woman used the money to buy a sewing machine so she could support her children and work from home. Chava feels that since his mother worked at home, the war hadn't been so severe. The boy helped the woman by taking clothes to the stores. Days later, several American soldiers arrived in the village. The children were happy and approached them. However, a woman told Chava the truth. The Americans weren't friends. They were there to teach the soldiers how to kill the townspeople. At home, everything was calm until another clash broke out. Fortunately, nothing happened to Chava's family. The boy helped his mother by offering clothes, but unfortunately, he didn't manage to sell anything. Chava started walking until he saw an empty bus and, without hesitation, got on to see it. The driver asked him what he was doing, and he explained that he was just playing, even though he needed a job. At first, the man mocked him, but ended up proposing that he would pay him to shout out the bus routes. At the end of the day, he returned home with money. He hadn't sold anything, but he had a job. He wanted to help around the house, and his mother was upset that he did so. However, she ended up accepting and only asked him to return. The next day, with some of the money he had earned, Chava invites his friends some drinks, but he was focused on a friend named Cristina Maria. But just at that moment the soldiers came in and the kids were very scared. Their fear increased when the principal began to call to the front all those who had already turned 12 and among them his friend Antonio. As he went to the front, a boy put his foot in and this irritated the captain and he ordered that the boy would go to a teacher. Said he was only 10, but the captain said that's how he would learn. The boy took the opportunity to run, and the soldiers went after him. Antonio was very scared and couldn't help but urinate his pants. The father of the church, seeing what happened, tried to stop him, but he couldn't do anything. Fito, knowing that Chava liked Cristina, handed her a note addressed to his friend stating that she was ugly. Cristina got upset. Chava approached her to invite her to throw paper fireflies, and Cristina complained. Chava explained that it wasn't him, and Cristina ended up going curfew. Chava and his friend accompanied Cristina home. At that moment, a confrontation began and the boys began to run. Chava didn't follow his mother's orders and was punished. Weeks later, the boys had a visit from Uncle Beto. Chava told him everything that had happened. The moment was interrupted by another confrontation, this time much more intense. At that moment, a loud scream was heard for Angela. Beto pulled out a gun and went outside, and Chava followed him. They tried to help, but unfortunately, it was too late. Chava and his uncle returned home. There to do. The next day, Keila asked her brother how long he'd been with the rebels. He explained that she was at the last point between the guerrillas and the capital. So things were going to get worse soon. Chava was about to turn 12 and needed to take him or the soldiers would. His mother refused, and as he said goodbye, his uncle gave him a radio so he could understand what was happening. He told him which station to tune into and to be careful because it was prohibited. At that, they looked for him. It was time to leave. Days later, Chava began listening to the station, but upon seeing a couple of soldiers, he changed it without hesitation and began dancing like crazy to hide it. That afternoon, after finishing his homework with Christina, they went out to listen to the radio and shared their first kiss. The moment was interrupted by loud screams. The soldiers were taking some women away. The priest tried to stop them, but the soldiers ended up beating him. Chava runs to the church and innocently asks, "Recruiting girls now?" too, but the man didn't know how to answer. Days later, the bus ran out of gas, and Chava, seeing the hose being used, decided to try it, which come intoxicated. Keela, seeing her son, began hitting the driver and didn't near her again. Shortly after, Chava was listening to the forbidden song, "Cardboard Front of the Soldiers." The priest saw him and turned off the radio. The boy obeyed. However, when he left, he turned it back on, causing a soldier to chase him. However, the priest, to save Chava, played the song over the church loudspeakers. This angered the soldiers, as the song was forbidden. When he got home, his mother asked him for the radio. She had heard what had happened. The next day, a boy reads a poem that says, "No child in my school wants to go fight. They don't like war because they prefer to play. The soldiers are looking for us and want to recruit us, but they'll never find me or my friends." At that moment, several guerrillas enter the school and a new clash begins. This time it was stronger than before. There was even a tank. Chava noticed his mother was in the middle of the clash and began to run toward her. Surprisingly, they both escaped unharmed. Everything passed, and Chava visited the church and noticed that the soldiers had beaten the priest. They blamed him because a sniper had climbed the bell tower. When Sunday arrived, the priest didn't perform the Eucharist. However, he said a few words to them. The skeptics say that if God existed, there would be no wars, but I tell you, if men obey God's laws, then there would be no wars. The priest added that it was no longer enough to pray and that they should fight. Days passed and the situation was getting worse. The school was closed, and Keela decided to move with her mother across the river. It was safer there for now. That night, Keela returned her radio to Chava. The next day, while listening to the radio, into the driver, who mocked them. The kids, annoyed, began running for him for several blocks. However, they were already tired and heard the song about the blue backpack and immediately, things didn't go any further. Weeks later, everything seemed to be improving, and the boys even went to play in the river. What they didn't expect, their friend Antonio would find them. The boy told them what he had experienced in the army. However, he had changed to intimidate people with his weapon. Fortunately, it didn't go any further. One day, a guerrilla gave Chava a message. The next day there would be a recruitment campaign, and they should hide. They were going to recruit everyone, regardless of age. Chava and they began to go door to door. The next day he arrived and didn't find any children. Everyone remained silent on top of the houses. A few days later, Chava's 12th birthday arrived. However, his grandmother removed a candle. They had to remember that Chava was turning 11. When he arrived, Chava was happy. However, when he saw that one was missing, he started running. He didn't want to be recruited. Christina followed him batteries for his radio as a gift. Days later, the soldiers returned, and like the previous time, they didn't find any children. Unfortunately, they found the notices Chava had handed out at various homes. They knew someone was snitching on the recruitment. Days later, Chava saw her uncle's friend captured and immediately went to the priest for help. She didn't know he'd also been taken. Eventually, a surprise recruitment came and caught them off guard. Fortunately, most managed to hide, but unfortunately, others didn't. That night, the boys didn't come down from their houses. According to Chava, he had already counted 230,000 stars and wanted to tell Christina about it. However, when he went home, he noticed it had been bombed. Chava tried to enter, but the soldiers caught him, and his disabled friend threw rocks at them and helped him escape. The soldiers went after him. Chava wanted to find Christina safe, but all he found were pieces of her dress. Chava couldn't hold back his tears. The war had taken many things from him, his childhood, friends, his school, but now it had completely broken his heart. That same morning, Chava gathered his things and went with his friends to join the guerrilla movement. Near the river, a man found them and took them to the hiding place. However, they didn't expect that minutes later they would be attacked by the army. A fierce clash broke out, and the only rebels left were the children, who were now receiving orders from the soldiers. The grandmother wakes Chava up. They had to leave. The soldiers were destroying everything. The mother started waking her children and discovered that Chava's things were gone. It was obvious she had left. The grandmother says there was no choice and they had to leave. Chava and his captured friends were accused of being traitors. Chava was thirsty, his feet hurt, but all he could think about was why they wanted to kill them if they hadn't done anything. The soldiers made them walk quite a distance, and then they saw their disabled friend on a rope. They finally reached their destination. It was a place far from the town where they killed traitors so they wouldn't be found. Here, they made them kneel and one by one they began to eliminate them. Now it was Chava's turn. He was very scared, but the guerrillas appeared. Chava and his friend took advantage of the situation to start running. It was a fierce confrontation. Chava didn't know where to go and chose to hide. After several seconds, he noticed a soldier lying next to him with a weapon. Chava grabbed it without hesitation, wanting to use it against a soldier. However, when he saw that it was just a boy like him, he chose to just leave. While all this was happening, the town was fleeing. Chava couldn't find her son and chose to return. Chava returned home and saw everything burning. Fearful and frustrated, he began to scream. As the minutes passed, his frustration turned to tears. He thought the war had taken everything from him. Chava was disoriented because she couldn't find her son. Chava, seeing her, gave her a hug and told her he was okay. The next day, Chava put Chava in a truck, leaving for the United States. Chava sold her car to pay for the trip, and before leaving, Chava gave his mother a big hug and promised to return for them. Chava ends with a few words, saying that he didn't want to go to the United States but knew he had no future in El Salvador. His story could have been told by one of his deceased friends, but it was his turn. Chava escaped to the United States and, with much help, reunited with her family 6 years later. The Civil War lasted 12 years, leaving more than 75,000 dead and 1 million exiled. Thousands of children around the world continue to suffer at the hands of war and conscription. If men obeyed the laws of God, there would be no war. Don't forget to subscribe and comment if you've experienced